Most men assume attraction builds through consistency. It doesn't. Consistency is what maintains comfort, not desire. What actually triggers interest operates on a completely different mechanism, and the gap between what men believe works and what actually shifts attention is where most confusion enters. Men approach attraction as if it's a negotiation. Show up reliably, demonstrate value, build trust, act predictably. The assumption is that if you maintain the right behavior long enough, interest compounds. But that's not what happens. Predictability doesn't generate pull, it creates familiarity, and familiarity doesn't feel like attraction, it feels like safety. Safety is valuable in relationships, but it's not what makes someone lean forward. I'll come back to why that matters in a moment. First, notice what men typically do when they sense distance. They increase effort, more attention, more communication, more reassurance. The logic makes sense. If distance appeared, proximity should close it. But the logic assumes attraction operates like a transaction. It doesn't. Distance often appears not because something is missing, but because something predictable has been established. Here's where the misinterpretation deepens. When a man becomes more available, more responsive, more willing to accommodate, he believes he's solving a problem. What he's actually doing is confirming a pattern. The pattern isn't "this person cares." The pattern is "this person is easy to predict." And predictability in the early stages of attraction removes tension. Without tension, attention drifts. This is the point where most men assume they need to demonstrate more value, better conversations, deeper emotional availability, increased investment. The idea is that if you prove your worth clearly enough, interest will stabilize. But interest doesn't stabilize through proof. It fluctuates through uncertainty. The moments where interest intensifies are not the moments where everything is clear. They're the moments where something doesn't quite resolve. What men interpret as mixed signals, unpredictable responses, inconsistent availability, sudden shifts in warmth, often aren't confusion, they're calibration. The question being answered isn't, "Do I like this person?" The question is, does this person's attention feel like something I need to earn or something I already have? If the answer lands too quickly on "already have," interest doesn't grow. It plateaus. Now, this is where behavior that feels counterintuitive actually functions. Small, well-timed unpredictability, not chaos, but slight deviation from pattern, reintroduces the question. A brief delay where immediate response was expected. A shift in tone where consistency was assumed. A moment of disengagement where focus was guaranteed. These aren't manipulations in the malicious sense. They're recalibrations of the dynamic. They reintroduce the possibility that attention isn't automatic. Men usually resist this. It feels dishonest. It feels like game playing. The instinct is to be straightforward, consistent, transparent, and that instinct is rooted in fairness. But attraction doesn't operate on fairness principles. It operates on perception shifts. The perception that shifts attention isn't, "This person is better than I thought." It's, "This person is harder to predict than I assumed." Let me pause here and reframe this from a different angle. What men often call confidence is actually emotional self-containment. It's not about believing you're superior. It's about not requiring external validation to maintain your internal state. The moment someone appears emotionally self-sufficient, meaning their mood, focus, and energy don't hinge on someone else's response, a psychological shift happens. The other person's attention stops being something you need and starts being something they wonder if they've secured. That shift, the shift from, "Does this person like me?" to, "Do I still have this person's attention?" is where interest intensifies. It's not about withdrawal, it's about removing the sense that attention is unconditional. The second attention feels guaranteed, it stops feeling valuable. Not because people are shallow, because value is psychologically tied to scarcity, and attention that never wavers doesn't feel scarce. This is why small, irregular gestures often produce stronger effects than large, predictable ones. A spontaneous, unexpected moment of focus, not planned, not routine, not part of an established pattern, registers more intensely than consistent, scheduled attention. It's the irregularity that creates impact. The brain doesn't habituate to irregularity the way it does to routine. Routine becomes background noise, irregularity stays foreground. So when men ask what makes someone attractive, the answer isn't a trait, it's a dynamic. It's the presence of emotional self containment combined with the strategic disruption of predictability. Not cruelty, not neglect, not games for the sake of games, but the refusal to become a fixed point in someone else's emotional landscape. The moment you become fixed, you become safe. And safe doesn't generate the kind of attention that feels like desire. Here's the consequence most men don't anticipate. Once predictability is established, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. You can't suddenly withdraw attention after months of availability and expect the same effect. The context has already been set. The dynamic has been named. What would have worked as calibration early on reads as punishment later. Timing matters. The impression formed in the first few interactions sets the frame for everything that follows. This is where men often double down on the wrong strategy. They sense distance, so they increase transparency. They explain their intentions more clearly. They remove ambiguity. They try to make everything explicit. But clarity doesn't restore interest when the issue isn't confusion. The issue is that the outcome feels predetermined. The conversation has already been answered internally. Adding more words doesn't change that. It reinforces it. Now here's where the contradiction surfaces. Men are told to be emotionally available, to communicate, to show interest clearly. And all of that is true in established relationships where trust and stability matter. But in the early stages, before the frame is set, too much clarity too soon removes the very thing that creates pull. The question, what does this person want from me, becomes, I already know what this person wants. And once that question is answered definitively, attention reallocates. This isn't an argument for dishonesty. It's an observation about how attention actually moves. Attention doesn't move toward certainty. It moves toward gaps, toward the unresolved, toward what still feels slightly out of reach. And the gap doesn't have to be large. It just has to exist. A slight delay, a momentary shift in tone, a brief period where focus isn't automatic. These aren't cruelties. They're course corrections that prevent the dynamic from flattening into routine. The men who naturally do this don't think of it as strategy. They simply don't orient their entire emotional state around one person's response. They have other focuses, other priorities, other sources of validation. So their attention fluctuates naturally. It's not withheld intentionally. It's distributed realistically. And that distribution, the fact that their focus isn't constant, is what keeps the dynamic alive. Men who struggle with this tend to collapse their entire emotional framework around one interaction. Every message matters. Every delay feels significant. Every shift in tone gets analyzed. The problem isn't that they care. The problem is that the care becomes visible in a way that removes mystery. The second someone senses they have your full, unwavering attention without needing to do anything to maintain it, the psychological balance shifts. You're no longer something they're trying to figure out. You're something they've already categorized. And once that categorization happens, behavior gets filtered through it. The same gesture that would have felt intriguing early on now feels predictable. The same message that would have sparked curiosity now feels expected. It's not that the behavior changed, it's that the frame changed. And the frame is set early, usually within the first few interactions. So the question isn't, what should I do to be attractive? The question is, what frame am I setting in the first few exchanges? Because once the frame is set, everything that follows gets interpreted through it. If the frame is, this person is completely available and completely predictable, then availability stops feeling like generosity and starts feeling like a given. And givens don't generate interest, they generate comfort. Comfort is useful, but it's not the same thing as desire. This is where most dating advice fails. It treats attraction as if it's about qualities: be confident, be interesting, be successful. But attraction isn't a static evaluation, it's a dynamic perception. And the perception that generates interest isn't, this person has impressive qualities. It's, this person's attention isn't something I can take for granted. The moment attention feels guaranteed, it loses psychological weight. Not because people are cruel, because attention that never shifts doesn't require mental energy to secure. And without that mental energy, interest doesn't intensify. It stabilizes. Stability is what you want after attraction is established. But in the beginning, stability is what prevents attraction from igniting in the first place. Here's what that means practically: small disruptions, slight unpredictability, brief emotional unavailability, strategic moments where response isn't immediate, function as recalibrations. They prevent the dynamic from settling into a rhythm where one person's attention is assumed and the other person's attention is something being worked for. The balance has to feel uncertain, not hostile, just uncertain. And here's the part men resist most. This dynamic doesn't reverse once it's set. You can't establish yourself as completely available, completely predictable, and completely transparent, and then later try to reintroduce mystery. The context has already been defined. The only move at that point is to accept the frame you've created or exit and start fresh elsewhere with a different approach. Most men never make this adjustment because it feels morally wrong. It feels like manipulation. It feels like you're playing games instead of being authentic. But the alternative, being completely available, completely clear, and completely consistent from the start, doesn't produce the outcome they want either. It produces comfort, sometimes friendship, rarely sustained desire. So the real question isn't whether this dynamic is fair. The question is whether you're willing to operate within a reality where attention doesn't follow the rules you wish it followed, where clarity doesn't always strengthen connection, where availability doesn't always deepen interest, where the thing that feels most honest, total transparency, is often the thing that flattens attraction before it has a chance to build. Once this pattern becomes visible, you start noticing it everywhere. The relationships where interest stayed high, the interactions where someone remained engaged, the dynamics where attention didn't fade. In almost every case, there was some element of unpredictability, some refusal to become a fixed point, some maintenance of emotional self-containment that prevented the other person from feeling like the outcome was already decided. From here, things don't reset, they recalibrate. And recalibration doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone recognizes the frame being set and adjusts before it locks in. After it locks, adjustment reads differently. Intention shows. And once intention becomes visible, the dynamic you were trying to create has already shifted into something else.